Are wedding professionals allowed to use photographs in which event guests or the wedding guests appear? We are going to unpack the legality of doing so in this week's episode. Stick around.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hello out there. Welcome back to Wedding Industry Law. My name is Rob, a wedding lawyer, and today we are going to be talking about the legal implications of using a photograph for the promotion of our wedding business that features event guests, not the clients. That's the easy one. Event guests that may not have signed some type of release. What are the implications if you publish that photograph to your website? Maybe you sell it to Hallmark. It appears in Times Square. Who knows? We're going to get into some copyright issues, but mostly we are going to be delving into the concept of the right of privacy. The right to privacy is a kind of like a broad term, but a category of that has to do with the right we have to own our own image, our own likeness. And that goes to everyone for the most part, not just celebrities like Harry Styles, Brad Pitt, Lady Gaga, but to the average Joe Blow. Based typically, depending on what state you're in, you have rights to be the one to determine whether or not your likeness appears in a photograph. But enough about me jawing on about this. And that is because I know just enough to be dangerous about this subject, and you don't want to be in danger. You want to be protected. You want to be loved. And in order to generate that love, I have two fantastic attorneys, Maurice Ross and Laura Michelle Horgan from Barton Law in New York City. These two have decades combined experience litigating the issues of copyright infringement, litigating the issues of privacy. They've represented high-profile wedding industry professionals, and I'm so glad to have them on. But let me educate you a little bit more about their backgrounds. For nearly 3 decades, Maurice Ross has represented corporate and individual clients in numerous high-profile, sophisticated intellectual property matters relating to business transactions and commercial litigation. He works with clients to develop intellectual property strategies, including strategies for procurement, licensing, and enforcements of copyrights, trademarks, and patents. Maurice also advises clients on a wide range of issues relating to internet law and social media, including issues like today concerning rights of privacy, rights of publicity, and defamation. And let me just tell you, he's one heck of a piano player as well. Laura Michelle Horgan handles all aspects of litigation in federal and state courts with a concentration on commercial business disputes, white-collar criminal defense, intellectual property disputes, and other complex litigation matters. She regularly represents public and private corporations, financial institutions, major energy suppliers, media conglomerates, sports leagues, and well-known consumer product companies. So glad to have them both on the show. We're going to have their contact information in the show notes and in the video description in case you want to reach out. And without further ado, Laura Michelle and Maurice, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Well, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. As we are recording this, it's a little chilly here in Atlanta, Georgia. I can't even imagine what's going on in y'all's neck of the woods. But I thank y'all very much for being here. As the listeners and the viewers learned at the top of the show, you guys are prolific. You've represented wedding industry professionals, celebrity wedding professionals, I would say. You've done a lot of intellectual property work for decades and decades. And I am so happy that you're on the show to help our listeners through some of these concepts. The first thing that I wanted to kind of unpack with y'all both is the concept of what rights a wedding guest has with regard to their image, their likeness as it appears in a photo. So by way of example, if the primary photographer, professional photographer of a wedding takes a picture of some event guests doing something cool, dancing or whatever, and that photographer uses that image that has the event guests in it for promotion, it's on a billboard, whatever the case may be, what rights do the people in that photograph have? What are the implications legally with that regard? And that's for either of you guys.
Well, let me start. You don't give up your rights when you attend a wedding. Attending a wedding is no different from attending any other event. A wedding is normally a private event, which means it doesn't occur in a public forum, doesn't occur on a sidewalk or in a park. It can become a public event if it occurs on a sidewalk, but most weddings are in private places. That means a person who appears in a photograph has rights of publicity and rights of privacy relating to that photograph. Now, unfortunately, there is no national right of privacy or publicity. These issues arise under state law, and every different state has slightly different protections. For example, in New York, we have statutory protections for rights of publicity and rights of privacy. But if you appear in a photographer's photograph and it is used for a commercial purpose, your rights have been violated if you have not provided a consent. Now, from the point of view of somebody who puts on a wedding, a lot of folks are smart enough to make the guests sign a release of some kind so that at least the people who got married can use the photographs in their publicity about the marriage. But absent providing a release, you as a guest at a wedding have rights. Now, here's the problem. Enforcing those rights is not so easy. Why? Well, litigation is expensive. So unlike somebody who owns a copyright, the guest does not own a copyright in the photograph. The photographer owns a copyright. So the photographer could issue a takedown notice, and it's easy to get photographs removed from websites when there's copyright infringement. Not so easy if you're a guest at a wedding and your privacy has been violated. To do so, you have to actually begin litigation if you cannot convince the bad guy to stop using your photograph. Litigation is expensive. So while I say that you have these rights, they're not very powerful rights. And the way to enforce them often is to retain counsel, to send a cease and desist, and then to pray that the other side is, they're decent people who are going to honor your rights. If they're not decent people, you're going to have to sue them, and lawsuits are expensive. And the problem is your damages as a guest and in a wedding are rarely very much. Even if you win the lawsuit and you've spent $100,000 on legal fees, you're not going to collect a lot of damages. So while I do say that you have these rights, the reality is from an economic standpoint, they're not very powerful rights.
Excellent. Excellent point with that. A lot of our episodes, I talk about a lot of times when you file a lawsuit, you're oftentimes throwing good money after bad. But I wanted to unpack something that you said there, and that is that the concept of copyright, that being who has the ability to utilize the photograph, is entirely different than the privacy right that you're describing, in that it's a protection of the person as they appear. These are two separate things, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, and copyright is protected by federal law. There is no state copyright law. Rights of privacy and rights of publicity are protected by state law. Now, as to both rights of privacy and publicity, there are issues of fair use. And a defense to a claim of a right of publicity or privacy can be the defense of fair use. And Laura might be able to illuminate us on the doctrine of fair use if that's appropriate.
Absolutely. Laura Michelle, let's hop in here. Let us know what's going on with that.
Sure. Fair use is a defense under the copyright law, which can be used if someone has a work that they've used without permission of the owner. So it's a defense to copyright infringement. There's a 4-part test for whether something would constitute fair use. And the test would be whether it's a commercial nature, and obviously a wedding would not be, a photo at a wedding would not be for a commercial nature. The second part would be the nature of the copyrighted work, whether it's creative or factual or published or unpublished. One would argue that a photo taken at a wedding is, not intended to be a published work. The amount and sustainability of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work. I mean, it's a photo at a wedding. It's not going to be on every, on every People magazine and New York Times, etc. And the effect of the use, the fourth factor, the effect of the use on the potential market or the value of the copyrighted work. Well, what's the value of a photo, of a guest at a wedding? It's pretty low. So I would say that under copyright law, you'd have a pretty good fair use defense. But Maurice can chime in if I've gotten that
yes. Right. And in contrast, under right of publicity and privacy law, fair use doesn't get you as far. So while fair use may be a good defense to copyright claims, it often doesn't work when it comes to rights of publicity. And even as to copyright, the courts throughout the country have been making fair use harder to prove. It's a hard defense to prove. It's a very narrow and technical defense. And for example, in a recent case involving the Trump organization that Laura brought my attention to this morning, the Trump organization lost in its attempt to argue that a photograph of the Trumps taken at a wedding was fair use. And it's not so easy to prove fair use. Those who contract for weddings or who pay photographers often think, well, I have the right to use these photographs. And even if I don't have the right, it's fair use. Be very careful. I would not rely on the doctrine of fair use very much to defend against either copyright infringement or violations of the rights of publicity or privacy.
That makes sense. And before wedding professionals that are listening to this freak out, can you dive in a little bit about whether or not if the event guest is a quote unquote nobody versus if the event guest is Michael Jordan, Donald Trump, Harry Styles? Like, does the celebrity or the value of the image in terms of the person appearing in it matter to fair use?
It matters a great deal. It's probably not fair. So I'm not a celebrity, and nobody would care if my picture was taken.
Not to me, Maurice.
Maybe my mother.
You're a celebrity to me.
But if Michael Jordan's picture is taken and used without his permission, that's a big deal because his photographs have value. The rights of publicity are valuable primarily to celebrities. For those of us that are just average persons, it's hard to bring a lawsuit under the right of publicity because it's hard to prove damages. I'm not damaged if a picture of me at a wedding shows up on Facebook, but Michael Jordan might suffer damage if that happens. I hope I haven't lost you.
No, you're still there.
I can hear you.
Loud and clear.
Okay.
Let me throw you in.
Michael Jordan, could have a problem because he may have signed a contract for the limited use of his photographs for certain products. And if you use his photograph, it could be that Michael Jordan faces a breach of contract, and then there could be a three-way lawsuit involving a lot of complexities.
That makes sense.
So yes, it makes a big difference if a celebrity is involved.
Let me throw you one more wrinkle with that then. Say it's not a celebrity, but it's perhaps an event that, this person might not want to be associated with. And then when when that image is published, maybe they get, their reputation knocked or something like that. Is that something that would affect fair use or even the damages to a publicity or privacy claim?
Well, this is a very fact-intensive situation.
My bad.
If it's a doctor who doesn't want to be seen at a Trump rally, that could be a problem. And if it could affect your professional reputation, you might be able to prove damages from the unauthorized use of a photograph. That's true. And there are cases where that happens. I have to tell you, though, that in situations like that, proving damage is hard. And you've got a problem whenever you bring a case like that and you are either the celebrity or the person who brings the case. And that is, there is always the defense that you consented to appear in the picture by appearing at the event, okay? And if you're on the defendant's side, what you argue is, look, he voluntarily appeared at this event. He voluntarily danced his way on the dance floor with 1,200 people. He was having the time of his life, and he knew photographs were being taken. He didn't object to any of those photographs. So he consented to those photographs being taken and distributed. Consent can be a valid defense. So these are very hard cases to bring, even if you're worried about your reputation. And let me talk about one other thing. And Laura knows about this more than I do. There's something called the Streisand effect. And I have a lot of clients who are doctors who come to me and their photograph has been taken in a compromising position, or maybe their ex-girlfriend has posted some pornography about them. Listen, what I often tell my clients is the worst thing you can do is bring suit and go public with it. Because the Streisand effect is when you bring suit and it becomes a matter of public record, it can also create more bad publicity than you would ever have if you stayed silent. Often the best approach, if you are the victim of one of these violations of your rights, is to stay silent. In a few days, nobody will notice. There are millions of posts on Facebook every day. Nobody pays attention to a post from 8 days ago. Okay? So chances are this is not going to be harmful to you, and you really have to balance the cost of litigation versus the benefit. And if you stay silent, sometimes that's the cheapest and most effective way to deal with it.
And that absolutely was the right advice for a client of mine who had hired someone as part of a production team who then trashed the company on some kind of freelancer website. And of course, my client was angry because it was untrue. And, the person was clearly a bit unhinged, but we had told the client, sit tight and, it's going to pass. And if you start chasing after it, it might have the Streisand effect of making it more of a big deal than this post that nobody's thought about since then.
And
the reason it's called the Streisand effect, Barbara Streisand, when she was young, had a reputation for being impossible to deal with. And if somebody wrote something bad about her in the media, she would complain and yell and scream. And she got a lot of bad publicity, and her reputation was harmed very, very much by having this image of somebody who can't take the heat, So sometimes it's better to stay silent. The other option, though, sometimes if something is published and you don't like it and it's on Yelp, Facebook, social media, you have the right to publish yourself. So instead of suing them, you can strike back by publishing your own opinion and explaining why what they published is not a fair representation of who you are and what you've done. Sometimes the best approach is not to hire somebody like me to litigate, but to exercise your right of free speech.
Absolutely. Sometimes you could say the only thing that beats bad speech is better speech. So I completely understand that sentiment. And I also would like to chime in and say that Barbara Streisand's version of Jingle Bells is the best version of Jingle Bells ever from her Christmas album from, 1967 or whenever it was. So I was actually thinking in my mind, is that Barbara Streisand effect? What's going on? So I'm glad that you answered that.
Well, speaking of Jingle Bells, Joe, just so you know, as people, I like to get to know my audience, and you can always find me playing the piano most nights on Facebook Live from 7 to 9. I've done that as a public service during the pandemic. And a lot of my clients in the wedding industry, actually, including many of you, often tune in. So if you want to meet other folks in the wedding industry, come tune in on Facebook Live, and I'll play some songs for you. And the interesting thing is, are there copyright issues and issues about my image when I appear on Facebook Live? And of course, I have to worry about all of those things every day.
Well, I'm going to have y'all's information and the Facebook Live and Instagram handles and all that in the show notes. So if anybody's interested in seeing Maurice play piano, and particularly that version of Jingle Bells, I would recommend that you click on those links and watch them. And guys, in the last couple minutes that we have for the program, can each of you kind of address what are some of the things that a wedding professional should kind of look out for, maybe one or two kind of action items that would prevent them from being a defendant in either a copyright infringement claim or, more importantly, some type of publicity or privacy lawsuit? I know that you mentioned, Maurice, earlier the concept of getting a release, but I know that that might be difficult to do in a wedding that might have 500 people in it. So if you guys can speak to the copyright or privacy issues with what they can do, that would be helpful as we wrap up the program.
Well, I'll go first. Fundamentally, the person who throws a wedding should have a contract with every vendor, especially the photographer, number one. Number two, it's not so hard to ask people as they enter a wedding to fill out a form. People are often asked to fill out their names and addresses on a form so that people know who attended the event. And you can put at the bottom of that form some release language, and that goes a long way. It's not that intrusive to make people sign that. After all, most weddings that I go to, there are nameplates. As you walk in, they give you a name badge or something. That's a good way to do it, and it helps protect you if this type of thing happens. Laura, do you have any concepts here?
No, I think the most important one that you said was the contract with the photographer, because you also have the issue of whether, and this comes up with my clients a lot too, is whether the photographer can then use those photos on their website to market or whatever, which becomes a whole separate issue. So you really want to look at the contract that you have with the photographer to make sure that you as the wedding professional or your client owns all of the rights and has limited where the photos can and cannot go.
That all makes sense. And I guess I've never thought about the component of perhaps maybe making the release in terms of the privacy a part of maybe the invitation or the guest book, when you send the guest book, things like that. And to everybody listening out there, as we've mentioned, copyright law is federal, but privacy and publicity rights are state by state, and they facts vary state by state. So I don't want anybody out there to rely on this podcast alone for anything that they would do with regard to protecting themselves from these type of lawsuits. That being said, even if you do some of these things that Maurice says or Laura Michelle says, I'm not going to guarantee you that you won't be sued. It might just be that you have a stronger defense against them. So, guys, thank you so. And I say guys is unisex for me, or y'all. It's unisex. I say I say
guys all day long.
Yeah, there you go.
Don't you worry.
Yeah, guys and dudes especially, that throws people off. Dudes is unisex to me as well. But anyway, I really appreciate both of you coming on. You've been excellent guests. You're extremely knowledgeable, and I know that I, and as well as my audience, has learned a great deal. So appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having us.
All right, thank you.
It's been 40-something episodes before I've been able to talk about Barbra Streisand. So I think that this is, for that reason alone, a fantastic episode. If you, in fact, enjoyed the content of this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Please visit us on our YouTube channel, Wedding Industry Law. Give us some love there. I'm really trying to build out the YouTube channel, providing you lots of content. And if you have a question, reach out, let me know. I do the best I can to address all comments, all questions in upcoming episodes, upcoming videos. And with that, folks, Wedding Industry Law Podcast every week drops on Monday. And with that, we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.